All right, so I'm not going to talk about price discrimination. This is lecture 11. So price discrimination refers to charging different consumers different prices. Often this is in order to optimize the price that you set to each group separately. So if you think, for example, that students have a different willingness to pay or seniors for something like a movie, right? Maybe because they have lower income. You might want to charge them a lower price because they are more price sensitive, and we saw that in the Monopoly lecture that when a group is more when consumers are more price sensitive, you have like a lower markup, and so that might be a reason why you would give a student discount, and that would be an example of price discrimination. You're charging a group, in this case students or seniors, lower prices. We also, like, happy hours are a good example of this, so getting people who otherwise would go home after work to come to a bar. You would charge them lower prices because they might be more price sensitive than a group that would be at a bar otherwise. Early bird specials, airfares, so advanced purchase, people who are purchasing early, or charging people who are traveling for business where their firm is reimbursing it. Different prices would also be good examples of price discrimination. This is the distinction here is from what we were doing last lecture. Last lecture, remember, we were doing uniform pricing where the monopolist was assumed to only charge one price. Okay. Here, firms can charge a number of prices. So there are four types of price discrimination. There's first-degree price discrimination or perfect price discrimination, which is what we'll talk about in this class. Basically, in perfect price discrimination, monopolist is able to charge each consumer their exact willingness to pay. This is, I think, a sort of an idealized extreme example that doesn't really exist in real life because we don't really know what consumers are willing to pay for something. But maybe an example, or the best example that I've come up with so far, is something like a car dealership, where you go and you spend a lot of time with the salesman, and you give financial information, and you drive around with them, and they ask you about what other types of cars you're willing to drive, and then they offer you a price, right? And so they're trying to learn about how much you're willing to pay in order to figure out what price can they ask of you. So that I don't think that's a great example of perfect price discrimination, but I think it sort of gets the point across. But it's got some interesting properties that I want to sort of talk about and I think are important to go through. So that's what we're going to do for the price discrimination lecture. Second degree price discrimination is when a firm charges nonlinear prices. So sometimes this can be like in the form of like an entry fee, and then you pay for each thing you use. So like at a theme park, right, you pay an entry fee and then for each ride, or it could just be like a cost discount. So like, if you want to buy, a gallon of milk, it's not twice as expensive as a half gallon. And there, firms are sort of, assuming that, then there's third degree price discrimination, which I have in the lecture notes, and I usually talk about, though I think for this situation, or for this semester, we're not going to do it because I lost a week or 2 weeks. But this is a situation where firms can see a group. So, when you go to the movies for a student discount, you use your student ID, and then they can charge different groups different prices. So senior citizens discounts, student discounts, military discounts, things like that. And then finally, there's been some newer research on what's called behavior-based price discrimination. And so this is trying to look at things that people do rather than like typifying them in order to charge different prices. So, maybe giving coupons to people can get them to purchase something. Is a good way to target like fairly price sensitive consumers, but we want to charge those consumers lower prices, so we give them coupons, and we assume that people who have higher willingness to pay aren't sort of gonna clip coupons. So one other point that I think I should make here, so in the perfect price discrimination case, we're going to see that total surplus is higher than under monopoly. This doesn't have to be the case. And so in the example I have for third degree price discrimination, which we won't cover this semester, I show that it can also be lower than under uniform pricing monopoly. So there isn't like a straightforward, like allowing firms to price discriminate is better or worse than like having firms charge a uniform price. Okay, so I'm going to talk about perfect price discrimination, which is lecture 11, pages 2 through 4. And recall that perfect price discrimination is when each consumer is charged their exact willingness to pay. So this is sort of a thought experiment, and I think it's going to help us understand sort of the sources of deadweight loss from monopoly, and some concepts about the value of profits that I think are important. But it's definitely a thought experiment, right? It's really hard for firms to know what a consumer's willingness to pay is. And so this isn't something that I think firms can do well in practice, but I still think it's sort of worth thinking about the idea. And if I had more time, I would go through and think about something a little bit less extreme, like third degree price discrimination, and sort of meld these ideas together. But unfortunately, I don't think we have time to do that. But if you want to read through the notes, you can get a sense for that. So for this lecture, let me start with sort of the running example that we've had throughout. So in this case, we're going to have inverse demand curve of 70 minus 4Q. And we're going to have a cost curve of 35Q, or let's just say a marginal cost in this case, or 35. So this is the example we used in the monopoly lecture and the perfect competition lecture. And so what this is going to correspond to is a marginal cost curve that looks like this, and a inverse demand curve like this. And the inverse demand curve is going to intersect at 70. That's when when the quantity is 0, price is 70. Okay. So the idea with perfect price discrimination is that the monopolist can charge each consumer their exact willingness to pay. So if you have each consumer here, right, all of these units, the consumer's willingness to pay, let's say, is higher than, I don't know, 65, right? And so for this consumer, this marginal consumer, right, their willingness to pay is exactly $65, and the monopolist can charge them exactly that. All right. For this consumer here, right, the demand curve tells us that all of these units will be sold if the price is 60, right? And so for this consumer here, this marginal consumer, their willingness to pay is $60, right? And the monopolist can charge them exactly $60. So they can charge this person $65, this person 60, this person, let's say, 55. Okay, so the first, I guess, thing that I want to talk about, what is marginal revenue for the consumer, or for the firm? And marginal revenue is the price that they can charge each consumer, right? So this consumer here, if they're the marginal consumer, they get charged $65, and so for that one unit, the extra money that comes in for the firm, the extra revenue that comes in for that firm is $65. So marginal revenue, right, is the price they can charge each consumer right? And so the marginal revenue curve, right, just looks like the inverse demand curve, right? They can charge this consumer $65, and so the revenue, or this person's demand is, or willingness to pay is $65, right, their marginal revenue from that consumer is $65. This consumer is willing to pay $60, but the marginal revenue for that consumer is $60, right? So they're able to charge each consumer, so the marginal revenue curve looks a lot like the demand curve. Now we know in general, right, if we're going to ask, how much will this monopolist produce? Right, well, we know in general, right, that marginal revenue has to equal marginal cost when the firm is profit maximizing. So they're producing an amount, right, so that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. This is going to be true generally. Okay. The idea being that if this consumer is willing to pay $65 and the marginal cost is $35, right, they're making a profit, right? So they should produce more, and they'll produce more and more and more until they get to this consumer who costs $60, right? This consumer who costs $60, or who can be charged $60 while the cost is $35, and so they make $25 in profit from them, all the way down until the final person who's willing to pay, right, is willing to pay $35, right? And once they've sold all units to all of these people, right, this person is the last one who's profitable. As they produce more, right, those consumers are not profitable to sell to because they're not willing to pay above marginal cost, okay? So if they were to sell less than this point, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right, they're losing money or it's not as profitable because there are people here who are willing to pay above cost, right? If they sell more quantity, right, they're losing money because they're selling to people who are not willing to pay marginal cost, or they're producing for people who are not willing to pay the marginal cost. And so this is generally true, right? And we've shown this with first order conditions in other lectures. But in this case, it's because so in this case, the argument here is if someone is willing to pay more than marginal cost, the monopolist will extract a profit. Okay, and then just recall, right, that the willingness to pay, right, or the marginal revenue curve is equal to the inverse demand curve, right, and so we get this relationship here, which is going to help us actually solve this question mathematically, right? So we know that the inverse demand curve is equal to marginal cost. That's this point here. This is how we figure out how much the monopolist will produce. So let's just set these things equal. So we have 35 as our marginal cost. Our inverse demand curve is 70 minus 1 over 4Q. All right. Solving for Q. So I'm actually just answering the question, how much will the monopolist produce here? Solving for Q. We get 1 over 4Q is equal to 35. Or Q star, or let's call this Q perf, for perfect price discrimination, is equal to 4 times 35, which is 140. Okay. So then What is consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss? Right, well, first of all, let's think about consumer surplus. So consumer surplus, right, the way that we learn this, right, was that it's the difference between what somebody's willing to pay and what they're actually charged, right? And so in this case, right, someone is being charged their exact willingness to pay, right? And so they get no surplus out of this, right? If they're willing to pay $20 and they're charged $20, right, they get no surplus, right? Or if they're willing to pay $65, right, but they're charged $65, there's no consumer surplus here. So consumer surplus is 0, right? But producer surplus, right, is the difference then between what they are charged and the cost to the firm, right? So for that person who pays $65, right, the cost to the firm is $35, and so the firm is getting $30 of producer surplus. For the person who's willing to pay $60, they're only charged $35, and so the firm is getting $25 of producer surplus. For the person who's willing to pay $55, right, it only costs the firm $35 to produce, and so the firm is getting $20 of producer surplus. And so the producer surplus in this case is the area under the this big triangle, this whole area. All right, and so to get the actual producer surplus and answer the question, right, what we can do is take the area of this triangle. The height is 70 minus 35. Right, and the base is 140. Times 1/2, and we get a producer surplus here of 2450. This is the same total surplus that we got in the Monopoly lecture, and so deadweight loss is 0. Okay. Because this is basically the total surplus under the perfectly competitive case. Okay, so so what we find is that under perfect price discrimination, right, consumer surplus is 0, right? The producer takes all of the surplus and there's no deadweight loss, right? Deadweight loss is exactly, the total surplus is the same as it is under perfect competition. So let me sort of go through some of the highlights here, right, or some of the takeaways. So just takeaways, I guess, from this example. So first, right, we see that the firm sells until price, right, or in this case the inverse demand curve, is equal to marginal cost, right? Where have we seen this before? Right, and the answer, right, is under perfect competition. right, we also had, right, price is equal to marginal cost. Okay, so like perfect competition, right, there's no deadweight loss. Right, because every unit with positive surplus is actually sold. Right, or every person who has a willingness to pay above marginal cost gets sold to, right, or they're able to purchase. So this is the sense, right, in which there's no, or I think this helps to highlight, right, why there's deadweight loss in monopoly, right? The difference right here between monopoly and you know, either perfect competition, right, or perfect price discrimination, right, is that the monopolist reduces surplus, or sorry, for deadweight loss, right, the idea is that, you know, the monopolist is reducing sales, right, and that creates deadweight loss because there are people who are willing to pay above marginal cost who don't get sold to. Okay. But the other thing, I guess, that's different from perfect competition right, is now the producer gets all of the surplus, rather than the consumer. Okay. So what does this tell us? Right. So first, right, let's think about sort of the difference between perfect price discrimination and uniform pricing, right? So under uniform pricing, right, the monopolist has, like when the monopolist wants to lower the price, it has to lower the price for all units. Right, and this, right, I mean, that's just what it means for uniform pricing, right? If it wants to lower the price, it has to do all units, right? This provides an incentive for it to not lower the price as well, right? Or this provides incentives to keep quantity down. Right, because there are people, right, if we get back to our graph, right, who are willing to pay quite a bit, right? And these people, the monopolist has to lower the price to in order to sell to people down here, right? Or in order to lower the price to sell to more people, they have to lower the price to these consumers, right? So if the monopolist wants to sell to this person here, right, they have to lower the price to this person if they can only set uniform prices. If they can perfectly price discriminate, they can charge each of these people their own willingness to pay, right? And so they don't have to have this trade-off between losing profits from this person to get sales to this person, right? So this incentive here is the source of deadweight loss from monopoly. Okay. The second point that I want to make here is that there's no deadweight loss in this example, even though the producer takes all of the surplus. All right, and so this is, the point here, right, is that profits in themselves are not necessarily a bad thing. Right, you hear this a lot, I think, in political debates that, certain firms are too profitable or something like that, right? But it's not that firms are profitable that leads to, and there's a political argument to be made there, or some questions about redistribution. But in terms of sort of thinking about the economics of this, or the sort of total surplus kind of arguments, right? It's not that profits necessarily are bad, right? We can put together a case where the producer gets all the surplus, but everyone who wants to be sold to is, and so total surplus doesn't change from perfect competition, right? The concern that we have about profitability of firms, or like why do we break up monopolies, has more to do, right, with this problem here, or problem number one, right, is that firms are underproducing and they're using their market power to create deadweight loss. And so that's something that maybe we as economists worry about more than whether or not just firms are profitable if they're able to price discriminate. The third thing that I just want to sort of make as a point here, right, is that we use the same. So I'm gonna the point here is about like what I'm gonna call conduct assumptions. Right. And here we use the same demand and cost curves for every for each different type of market structure. Okay, and so these are like the same sort of, I guess, what we call primitives, right? Or these, cost, right, as we saw, right? The cost came directly from the technology that firms had, right? So we solved for cost functions, right? That came from a production function, which is just something that, Uber is going to have a different production function than a Little Italy, because they just have different technologies for producing. Right? And demand just comes from, what do consumers like or don't like, right? And so these are things, right, that we call primitives, and they're hard for policymakers to change, right? Demand just comes from like, what do people like? What do they want, right? But, right, under the same demand and cost functions, we got very, very different outcomes, right? So with perfect competition, there was no deadweight loss. And with perfect price discrimination, there was no deadweight loss. Right? Whereas under uniform pricing monopolist, we had deadweight loss. Okay, so this differs. Right? Under perfect competition, right, the consumers were able to get all of the consumer surplus. Right? Under perfect price discrimination, right, the producers got all of the surplus. And under uniform pricing monopoly, right, there was a mix of both. Right? So we get very different outcomes based on, using the same preferences and the same technology, right, for these three different market outcomes. And the reason that I like to sort of make this point here, right, is because this is sort of where we have room for economists to make a difference in the world, right? Because it's really hard to change demand and cost primitives, right? It's hard to tell somebody, oh no, you should like this or you should prefer that, right? And I think probably as economists we feel uncomfortable doing that, right? But we can do something about conduct, right? So there, firms like government agencies like the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission, right, spend a lot of time thinking about mergers, right? Because they worry about uniform pricing monopoly, or maybe they worry about whether or not consumers are being hurt under, price discrimination schemes, right? And these are things that we can change as economists. And so it gives us some, at least from my perspective, right, this is sort of where economics gets interesting and sort of how we can change the world is figuring out, maybe we're not going to be in these extreme cases, right? We'll be like I think I argued, none of these cases sort of hold up well in the real world, right? But we can approximate these cases or approximate the real world and use economics to get better equilibriums or equilibria that have more total surplus or maybe, are more consumer friendly or something like that, depending on, what we think we should be optimizing.